Good evening. Welcome to our third Center for Urban Engagement lecture this year. And thanks to all of you for coming out on a cold night, not quite as cold as last night, but still, it was a chilly one out there today. And for some of you, this may be the first thing you're doing outside of your homes for the past 60 hours. So I hope everyone has stayed warm and safe. We have 4 Q lectures this year. Some of you may recall that in the fall we had the privilege and honor of hosting Noel Castellanos and also Kathy Eden for talks. And upcoming, we have Michael Emerson later in February. Michael Emerson is the author of Divided by Faith and the current provost of North Park University. So I encourage you to watch out for more information on that particular lecture. Tonight's lecture will be given by Natalie Moore. Natalie Moore is a reporter with WBEZ, Chicago's NPR affiliate, and many of you already know Natalie Moore through her book, The South Side. How many in here have already read at least part of The South Side? That's a good number. That's right about the number that I told Natalie. I said it would be dozens. And it looks like dozens have read at least part of the book. And some of you have read all of it. So we're privileged to hear from her tonight on a more expansive story about segregation, not only on the south side of Chicago, not only in Chicago, but in the entire region and the ways in which our actions and our lives play into segregation. I want to let you know that after Natalie's talk, we're going to have about 10 or 15 minutes of Q&A. So as you're listening this evening, please pay careful attention, write down questions you may have, and note that there are mics in each of the aisles. Get to those afterwards so that you can line up and ask your question then. And now please join me in welcoming Natalie Moore to Wheaton College.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I know that it is not warm outside, so I do appreciate you making the trek in the snow in the final hours of the polar vortex. Wheaton College, thank you so much for having me. Noah, thanks for bringing me here. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm going to play some audio for a little bit and engage you all on issues of segregation, Chicago neighborhoods, urban policy. And I know a lot of you are not from Chicago, so these are issues that I think are applicable to a lot of major American cities. A number of you have read the book, and I'm glad, and I think some others of you will be reading it soon. But I joke that this book is my dissertation for working at WBEZ for a decade. I have long felt that segregation was the elephant in the room that no one was talking about. As a reporter, I felt like all roads were leading back to segregation, whether we're talking about violence, economic development, affordable housing, public housing. This is the issue. And for so long, elected officials in Chicago have treated segregation as if it is something that they have no idea how it came about. And often self-selection and segregation are conflated. And so I want to just spend a moment explaining the difference. Segregation is about power, inequality, and resources. Separate is not equal in this country. Self-selection is people who choose to group together without it being government sanctioned. So the reason why our cities look the way they do often is because of where housing was built, where politicians decided to build highways, what school policy is going on. So all of these things are deliberate, and it's intentional, and it's insidious. I've also found that people in the Chicago region treat segregation as if it's a quirky characteristic, along the lines of deep dish pizza, Sears Tower, Lake Michigan. The Cubs lose all the time, except 2016, and segregation. And you often hear people say, well, I didn't create it. But if Chicago wants to be a world-class city, it has got to treat all of its residents equally and dismantle segregation, because segregation is about racial inequality. I know a number of you are spending some time in Woodlawn, so I'm going to play and talk in between. I'm going to build off of this work of segregation, which, I still work at WBEZ. And one of the things that I have heard that to me is the biggest compliment is when people who have read the book say, this is my story, I didn't know that it had a name to it. And that goes to the notion that we accept segregation as a way of life. Well, this is just how things are. The work that I have done, scholars have written about much more thoroughly than me. But what I wanted was for regular people who aren't in constant academic parlance to pick up the book and to understand. I grew up in a Black middle-class neighborhood called Chatham. It was great. The one thing that I'm not doing is saying that Black neighborhoods or people need to be fixed. And sometimes I have Black people who say, well, integration killed the Black community. No, it did not. My mother is from Woodlawn, and she had to go to school on a half-day schedule because the mayor didn't want to integrate the schools. You might die because a hospital wouldn't take you because of segregation. And so we have to remember that when Black migrants moved to Chicago, they had to live in certain areas, and these places were overcrowded. And there's also a myth that all of these businesses were Black-owned in these communities. They were not. And that gets to the crux of trying to understand what segregation is. It's a reason why the South and West Sides are Black. It is not happenstance. We also tend to talk about white flight in a vacuum. The neighborhood I grew up in, as wonderful as it was, it has what's called the black tax. Fewer goods and services, less city resources, more proximity to poverty and crime. And so on one hand, I learned this efficacy about block clubs. I've never lived anywhere else where I knew every single person on the block. But then you have to balance it with not getting the resources that you believe your neighborhood should get. And this goes across class lines. It could be if you are Black and you're living in an upper middle class, or low income neighborhood, you're still facing some of the same issues about your property values being lower because of the color of your skin. This racial inequality permeates when we're looking at food access, we're looking at education, we're looking at if you buy a home, what it is worth. And so I mentioned that my mother grew up in Woodlawn. I am a daughter of the Great Migration. My grandparents moved here from the South. Many Black families who were leaving the South were leaving because of racial violence there, the threat of being lynched or being a sharecropper and wanting better opportunity. My parents are both first-generation college graduates because my grandparents were able to, despite the odds, they did work hard, they did buy homes, and they were able to send their children to college. But the history of Woodlawn wasn't always available. The Black Belt is where Black migrants first landed. Have any of you read Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry? So that was based on her family. Her father and mother bought a house in West Woodlawn, which at the time was white. The neighbors had a fit. And the case ended up going, well, first I should say that the mother, Mrs. Hansberry, had to patrol the house at night with a shotgun. A brick was thrown into the house and almost killed 8-year-old Lorraine. The case went to the Supreme Court, and the Hansberrys won, not because of racial justice, but because not enough white families had signed the petition that said no Blacks allowed. When that case happened, 500 homes opened up in Woodlawn, and that paved the way for people like my grandparents to live in the neighborhood. That also was the precursor to the 1948 Supreme Court case that outlawed racially restrictive covenants. And these were deeds into a house that said you cannot rent or sell your home to someone black. Woodlawn is also home to the Blackstone Rangers. I've written about that. I have a book about that street gang, which was born in the Woodlawn area. And they were the El Rukins by the 1980s, and they are the first Americans convicted of domestic terrorism because of a perceived relationship that they had with Muammar Gaddafi from Libya. So where are we today with Woodlawn? What do you see? You see a lot of disinvestment. 63rd Street doesn't have businesses like it once was. The L train doesn't go far east like it once did. Some of the schools are subpar. But you also have this complicated relationship with the University of Chicago, which is just north in Hyde Park. And so the big thing that is happening now with Woodlawn is the Obama Presidential Center. Former President Barack Obama doesn't want to do a traditional library. He wants to have a museum in Jackson Park. Jackson Park is right off of the shores of Lake Michigan. There's a golf course there. It's nature. It's a park that you see family reunions and class reunions and one of the biggest house music festivals in the country. It's also a place that was the site of the World's Fair, and there's still some remnants there. The Museum of Science and Industry was the palace for the World's Fair back in 1893. So with the Obama Presidential Center coming, there is a lot of anxiety about, is the neighborhood going to change? Who is the neighborhood going to be for? So I want to play this story that talks about who is in Woodlawn. One of the things that I really enjoy about being a journalist, if anyone's thinking about doing it, is that I feel like I win arguments. And that's because I go off of facts, not feelings. And I'm not taking a position in this, but there's so many rumors, so many unknowns. And with those unknowns become things that aren't true, not because people are lying, but because they don't know. And so my colleague Becky Vivi and I set out to try to get some answers about East Woodlawn, the area that's closest to where the proposed Obama Center will be built. So let's take a listen.
When former President Barack Obama picked Chicago's Jackson Park to build his presidential center, it came with bold assurances.
This could anchor a transformation of the South Side to create more jobs, more business opportunities, more educational opportunities, more hope.
It's a transformation the community right next door has been after for decades. So they were excited, but also anxious about who will get to decide how the neighborhood benefits. WBEZ reporters Becky Vivi and Natalie Moore decided the place to start was to find out who owns what in East Woodlawn and why it matters. Driving around East Woodlawn through the blocks just south of the University of Chicago, there's something you can't miss.
You can see all this vacant land that was here that once upon a time was businesses in this community, but it's pretty massive.
It's all vacant.
We're at 63rd and Woodlawn, and to our left we see a condo development that has a coffee shop, Robust, on the ground floor, but across the street is vacant land.
Undeveloped property like this gives owners a particular kind of power, the power to reshape the look and feel of a community. So we analyzed the records of nearly 2,500 properties east of Cottage Grove between 60th and 67th Street.
And we found that the city owns by far the most property in East Woodlawn, about 10% of the whole neighborhood, and most of its land is vacant. For comparison, the University of Chicago owns 10%, but nearly all of its property is developed as part of the campus. No records could be found for another 10%, and the rest is owned by individuals or businesses. That means that the power to reshape East Woodlawn, it belongs to city officials.
And the city has the power to do pretty much anything it wants with the land. Sell it, rezone it, even give it away. But when it comes to East Woodlawn, they've not made any comprehensive plans for the neighborhood public. David Reifman is Chicago's Commissioner of Planning and Development.
We want to use our land most effectively for the type of community retail that might be desirable as we move forward.
But he says the city also wants to use its land to prevent people who live in the neighborhood from being forced out as the Obama Presidential Center gets built. Some local groups have called for a community benefits agreement. It's a contract of sorts that would protect current residents. The Obama Foundation has said no to that.
We heard him loud and clear. That is why we are calling for a community benefit ordinance.
But since it's really the city in control, I asked Reifman if they'd agree to one.
I don't think we're going to do a community benefits ordinance or a community benefits agreement. I think it's very important that what we are focused on is the issue of community benefits.
With little clarity from the city on what they plan to do, we called up Michael Pagano.
He's with the University of Illinois at Chicago and says the city can use its land in many different ways, like for a park or selling it to the highest bidder.
Or do they have a social responsibility of ensuring that the land is sold at maybe below market prices so that the value of the housing may not be as high as it could be if it's sold at the top of the price? That's the conversation the city has to have with itself.
Longtime resident Maddie Butler says that conversation better be with the community as well. Butler runs Woodlawn East Community and Neighbors, or WeCan.
We would like to have anybody who's developing open land in this community come through a community group who has the ability to say, we want you all to do X, Y, and Z in our community.
Her office is on the ground floor of an affordable apartment building that WeCan owns. Rents here start at $545 a month for a studio. She says with more than 3,000 affordable units in East Woodlawn, all that vacant land doesn't worry her.
If we wanted to build high-income property, we got enough open land to do that. And we don't have to touch people who are in fixed-income housing and low-income housing. We don't have to do that. And the only reason people do that is because of greed.
But she does want the city to implement a property tax freeze for homeowners who have been there for more than 5 years, so people aren't priced out as new construction and retail gets going. And Butler is working on a community-driven plan for redevelopment with a group called One Woodlawn. It's led by Reverend Byron Brazier.
He's connected to City Hall. His late father and another local pastor, Leon Finney Jr., got a bunch of city lots for $1 each in the late 90s. They started building houses along 63rd Street and sold them between $250,000 and $300,000. But their redevelopment plans stalled, and then the housing bubble burst.
When I met with Finney recently, he listed off all the properties he still owns, as well as some he plans to get from the city.
And then we've got the city of Chicago already agreed to let us build on another 5 acres of land.
He says the vacant land around is ripe for commercial development, including room for small Black-owned businesses.
We think that this neighborhood will be booming very shortly. We'll probably, by 2021, we will have probably built about 200 single-family homes for middle to moderate and low-income families.
And the houses he hopes to build this time around, he wants to list them between $350,000 and $600,000, even though the current median income in all of Woodlawn is $24,000, well below the city average.
The city would not confirm or deny what Finney told Natalie about buying city land. A spokesman did say some of the property Brazier and Finney were planning to develop never actually changed hands and is still owned by the city. Other recent transactions could provide some clues to what the city is doing with land in Woodlawn. Recently, the school board transferred a few vacant schools to the city for, quote, economic development. And last year, about a dozen vacant lots were sold to 2 developers who are now also building high-end homes.
Benjamin Van Horn is one of them. He bought 2 city-owned parcels in East Woodlawn and plans to build LEED-certified net-zero energy single-family homes. Van Horn walks me through one of the homes he's constructing.
It will have a roof full of solar panels as well as solar panels on the roof.
He says he plans to develop at least 17 new homes throughout Woodlawn and hopes to sell them in the same range as Finney. And his philosophy is, quote, development without displacement.
At a minimum, it means I will never kick anybody out of their home. Vacant land is my preference, and most of these vacant lots have been vacant for decades.
East Woodlawn is already a mixed-income community with higher-priced homes around the corner from affordable rentals.
And the City of Chicago has a unique opportunity to keep that dynamic while also helping bring new amenities, resources, and vibrance to the community. That is, if it really wants to. Becky Vivi,
Natalie Moore.
WBEZ.
And the public,
My name is Ramirez Moody.
the public
I'm a
service that we
developer here on the south side.
think that we did with that piece is online. So if you go to the story on the WBEZ.org site, we have an interactive map that's color-coded to see who owns what. So what were the biggest takeaways there? The city owns 10% of the land in East Woodlawn, and most of that is vacant. There are 3,000 units of affordable housing in East Woodlawn. And when we say affordable housing, I don't mean, oh, this is an apartment that's affordable. I mean that it's designated as affordable housing under the federal government, and you can't break that term. Sometimes it goes up to 30 years. And I think what Maddie Butler said was probably the most poignant, is that we have so much vacant land here that we don't have to displace anyone. And she believes that you can build high-end housing without displacing anyone, but she's also advocating for a property tax freeze for people who have lived there. So the city has, part of what journalism can do is be a watchdog. So we have the city on the record. We have them saying, well, we're not going to sell to any developers, which means that we can keep looking to see if they hold true to that promise. We know how much land that they own. The anxiety comes in because for so long, segregation and disinvestment in Chicago has meant that there are winners and losers. And so people are thinking about who are going to be the winners and who are going to be the losers in Woodlawn. And low income and people of color tend to feel like they are on the losing end when it comes to development. There's an expression called urban renewal. And in Chicago, Black folks have long called that a euphemism for Negro removal. That said, I, as a journalist, have seen fits and starts in development, and I'm not so sure that a bunch of white, wealthy Lincoln Parkers are chomping at the bit to move down to Woodlawn to be near the Obama Presidential Center. That said, I understand the anxiety of wanting to make sure that residents feel like they have a seat at the table and that they do get to benefit. I am also skeptical of all these new businesses that everyone thinks is going to be coming, just because I haven't seen that kind of investment in Black neighborhoods. But that doesn't, take away from people wanting to ask hard questions, but it also means that you have to look and understand what has the bifurcated development look like in the city. And so that leads me to talk about the hill that I plan to die on in Chicago, and that is that gentrification is the most misused word. So gentrification is a term that was first coined in London. Gentrification is about class, not race. Race and class are first cousins. But anyone of any race can be a gentrifier. The definition of gentrification is the displacement of low-income people who are then replaced by higher-income people. So I want to say that again. It is the displacement of lower-income people replaced by higher-earning income people. So a Black person could be a gentrifier. But what kind of gentrification do we see in Chicago? Well, Chicago is so racist and segregated that Black Southside neighborhoods do not gentrify. And that is based on data. Harvard University did a study about gentrification and showed that Black neighborhoods on the South Side do not. The University of Illinois at Chicago did a study showing the same thing. Researchers in Montana did a study on why Bronzeville, which was, it was the Black Belt, Bronzeville, then the low end, and then Bronzeville later, and that's where I bought a home for a rehab condo, a building that was rehab turned into condos. I bought it in 2008, right before the housing crash, for $172,000. And when I tried to do a short sale in 2014, it was assessed at $45,000. It was a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, gated parking, stainless steel, granite countertops. You can buy a car for $45,000. So the study that the Montana State researchers did was look at Pilsen. So Pilsen is a Mexican-American neighborhood, historic. It used to be a Czech neighborhood, and then it became an immigrant community. And Pilsen is undergoing gentrification. So it compared Bronzeville, which is black, to Pilsen. And their research showed that based on racial perceptions, Bronzeville was seen as poor, black, ghetto crime. Mexican was seen as fun, tacos, ethnic, Cinco de Mayo. And those racial perceptions shaped the direction that the neighborhoods went in. I've come to learn through reporting that gentrification is really a word that's a proxy for anxiety. When there's the unknown, or somebody sees somebody white walking their dog. And it's a lot more complicated than that. And so what is happening, and many of you are going to hear over and over again that Woodlawn is gentrifying. So me saying that it's not is not me saying that there aren't legitimate community concerns. But the research does not support that there's gentrification. And the biggest story in black neighborhoods, well, I'm gonna fan out even bigger. Gentrification is not the defining feature of the city of Chicago, even though we see it happening in places like Pilsen, Logan Square, Avondale. The biggest story in Chicago is a hollowing out of the middle class. We see wealth growing, and we see wages falling. And we see this hollowing out in the middle, and that is not talked about enough. It becomes, gentrification is a really sexy word. And it's a word, and there's another word that I hear a lot, regentrification. I don't even know what that means. But these terms are thrown out there to, again, express anxiety. If you look at what is happening in black neighborhoods, population decline, housing values falling, that is the issue. There are not people with hammer and hoes trying to gentrify Roseland, Avalon Park, West Pullman. That's not the story. It's more of a story of decline. And so for some reason, gentrification has been this laser focus that people want to put their attention toward. And so how do we have a more robust conversation about development? I'm a wordsmith, and so using the word gentrification over and over again dilutes the word from where it's really happening. And it also doesn't address the serious issues that we see facing in myriad neighborhoods in Chicago. Not all people want to hear this because they have it fixed in their minds about what's happening. Some of you have probably seen the development on 63rd and Cottage Grove. I had a colleague say, oh, you mean where gentrification is happening? I was like, oh, you mean where mixed income housing is happening? What is happening on that stretch, that used to be what's known as project-based Section 8. So usually Section 8 are vouchers that you go use to rent in the private market. A project-based Section 8 means that you have all the Section 8 vouchers in a development. That development got torn down and the federal government was going to give people vouchers elsewhere, but the neighbors there organized and got an affordable housing developer to come in. It is one of the few affordable housing wins that have happened in recent years in the city. So that development right there under the train tracks and along there, you have market rate affordable housing and also public housing that's there. I sometimes actually find it racist or anti-Black when something nice comes to a Black neighborhood and someone says that's not for me or that's not for them. Low-income people want nice things in their communities too. And if there are questions about if something is, their bike lane's being built, that's not for us. No, it is for you. Or if you don't think that it is, make it for you. And so we have to switch the way we think about development and what we demand of developers, what we demand of the city. So several years ago, we did a series about gentrification in Chicago, again, to try to do some of this myth busting. And so this is the story about why Black neighborhoods don't gentrify.
My name is Ramirez Moody. I'm a developer here on the south side of Chicago. Woodlawn is an area that is under transition.
On 64th and Ingleside, Moody's converting a 2-flat graystone into a single-family dwelling. The touches are fancy: heated floors, fake chandeliers for closet lights, and lots of space.
I mean, you can ride a bike down this hallway, and it just really gives you kind of like that Huxtable feel of a home.
Moody's selling these homes for $500,000. That's pretty steep considering Woodlawn's median home sales price was just $46,000 last year. The investor is taking advantage of the recession aftermath.
There were several short sales, which brought new buyers in to those properties at an affordable price. That drove down the market and made it more affordable for developers to come in and do the things that we're doing here.
Before the housing crash, Woodlawn was on an upswing with condo conversions. Back then, the median home sales price was $200,000. Other nearby Black communities were also revitalizing. Neighborhoods like Bronzeville, Woodlawn, Washington Park, and Oakland. Some worried that gentrification was underway.
Instead of it being white people in Bronzeville, Black people of middle class and even upper middle class, basically taking advantage of a good situation for housing prices.
Janet Smith is a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago who studies neighborhood change.
It raised this question of, is there Black gentrification?
According to Smith's research, the answer is no. One reason these areas improved but didn't gentrify is that they started out so far behind. Smith used census data to create what UIC calls a gentrification index. She says while wealthier Black newcomers moved into graystones, boosting home prices and median incomes,
what's going to do the rest, right? What's going to bring in the grocery stores, the boutiques, the kind of things that go along with the whole package?
People tend to think of gentrification as white people displacing people of color, but race is just one of the factors in UIC's index. At its core, gentrification is about class. So in theory, Black gentrification is possible, except it never quite happens.
If there isn't a sort of an infusion of a lot of capital to support that, or if, in the case of Black consumerism, retailers still have an aversion to Black consumers. Even if they have the green, they're still Black.
Recently, Harvard University researchers found that in Chicago, gentrification seemed to grind to a halt in places where the population was 40% Black. And yet, looks can be deceiving. People may drive by elegant homes, notice all the public housing that's been demolished, and wonder, how is this not gentrification?
And this is always the tricky part for people. If you clear people out, that's displacement. And gentrification is usually associated with displacement, but it's also replacement of people of higher income. You've got large tracts of land sitting there.
Smith is referring to empty land once occupied by public housing. Much of the mixed income replacement housing hasn't been built. But in other cases, it has. Oakwood Shores is a mixed income development in the Oakland neighborhood that replaced the Ida B. Wells public housing low-rises. Mary Smith used to live in Ida B. Wells.
Oh, it's much better. Because there was so much drugs over there then. It's a little drug, but not like it was in the project. You couldn't hardly walk. Every Every morning you come out to go to work, they were still out, just hanging out through here. Never go to sleep, never go to sleep.
Smith lives on a subsidized housing voucher in nearby Washington Park, but she's still connected to the area and appreciates the new amenities.
I love over here, but I ain't far away. That's why I come back. This is where I'm originated from. So I ain't gonna never just forget it. Got the track over there. We didn't have that at first. I'm glad they put one I could walk now. Lose some weight.
Smith is talking about Mandrake Park on 39th Street in the Oakland community. The park has lots of recreational facilities, a playground, and even tennis courts. Back in the late 1990s, former Alderman Dorothy Tillman worried those courts would attract white people and lead to gentrification. Turns out the area is still mostly black and, as we know, never experienced gentrification.
The labels, gentrification, upgrade, that's not really my concern.
Attorney Stephen Mitchell lives in a Bronzeville condo and is the co-owner of a local art gallery.
When I moved here in '99, over the years after that, I mean, the property values were skyrocketing. Every black professional that I knew, they were all clamoring to get in Bronzeville. You know, the prices had went up, you had all this equity in your house.
But the market crashed, leaving Buppies hundreds of thousands of dollars underwater, though momentum fizzled. Now, life in the neighborhood is slowly coming back.
One more time. What's up, Chicago?
You can hear it on a recent Friday night at Mitchell's Gallery Gouchard with its big picture windows that look out over 47th Street. An art competition is the cause for celebration. Art from the Black diaspora hangs on the walls. Martinis flow, house music pulses.
We're sort of on an upward trajectory because, you know, people do see the businesses coming up. Here at the gallery, you know, we open here. The Walmart is there on 47th and Cottage. People know about the Mariano's that's coming on 39th and King.
In a way, it's a return to Bronzeville's past, when 47th Street bustled with activity. Of course, that same past includes a legacy of segregation that restricted housing and limited blacks' economic opportunities. This complicated history resonates with activist Harold Lucas. As Bronzeville rebounds, he's on a mission to make it a tourism heritage district.
I think it's going to be an upscale community. You will see upscale venues. I think you're going to see a lot of small plate stuff, just like you see on the north side. I think you're going to see that same element coming out the spirit of African Americans with a very deep understanding of what my sweet potato pie should taste like.
That means building a neighborhood where black entrepreneurship is thriving and the cycle of poverty is broken, even if that's not technically gentrification. Natalie Moore, WBEZ.
So from time to time, I will have a white person at a talk come up to me or in the audience say, you know what, I can only afford X amount of dollars, and that means that I can only afford to live in a place like, let's say, West Woodlawn. I feel conflicted about that. Is my presence going to be disruptive? What do I do? The one thing I say is that everyone has the right to live wherever they want to live, and there shouldn't be barriers to that regardless of race. But what I do tell people is that if you think about your presence being disruptive, and this may be something that you're thinking about, even though you haven't moved to West Woodlawn, but for some of you all who are there, the advice that I give to people who ask that question is be a good neighbor and listen. Do not come in with a white savior mentality. Do not look at the trash or the disinvestment or the boarded up homes and say, why don't these people take care of their neighborhoods? Because the answer is not that simple. I don't know if anyone's ever seen this driving around Chicago, and I did a story on this because I was really determined to find the answer to this question. There's no other city in this country, no other place outside of black neighborhoods on the south and west sides that have signs at the beginning of the block that say, welcome to the 6200 block of South Ingleside. No loitering, no car washing, no loud music, we call the police, or whatever it is. These little public art signs, and there's somebody who is redoing these signs now to make them more welcoming. Instead of saying the no's and the don'ts, say, we welcome XYZ. The history of those signs go back to the Great Migration, trying to acclimate, rural Southerners to the urban bustling way of life. But what those signs also tell, I think, people is that this block doesn't take any mess, or that we have a block club. And so what's often overlooked, because Black people are pathologized so much, is that, yes, Black people care about their neighborhoods. If I were to take a guess, I would say that Inglewood probably has more block clubs than any other neighborhood in the city. So to the person who doesn't want to be disruptive, don't come in and say you're going to start an organization. Meet the people who are on the ground who are doing the work. Understand your block. Say hello to your neighbors. Too often, people want what I call a suburban urban way of living. They want the amenities of urban life, by the train, coffee shops, convenience, but they think things are going to be quiet all the time once it becomes 8 o'clock. Cities are messy. Apartment living is messy. My condo neighbor complained to me on New Year's Eve for being loud at 9 o'clock, and I wasn't even having a party. It was like kids. But I decided that someone who's at home and that miserable on New Year's Eve must be going through something, so I didn't say anything rude back. But my point is that, how do you think you live in apartment dwellings and think you're not going to hear your neighbors? And so we want this sterile lifestyle, but we want the fancy cheese shop and access to the L nearby. And there's also, when we think about housing in Chicago, it comes down to, I watch a lot of I Hate Tweet House Hunters. So if you ever see a Chicago couple on House Hunters, come find me on Twitter and let me know if I'm not already tweeting about them. Because I make fun of the people saying, oh my God, I only have $700,000 where I have no place to live. And so then I will say, please, someone give me $700,000. I will live in a mansion in Chicago. The median home price in Chicago is about $250,000. Chicago's strength and its weakness is its vastness, which is also why gentrification is this boogeyman. We're not landlocked. We're not tiny like Manhattan. We're not small like Atlanta. We're not landlocked like Washington, D.C. Chicago is so big, but the resources and attention only go to a handful of neighborhoods, which give this impression of unaffordability. But what's created are metaphorically gated communities. So the one thing that I want to challenge you all with this evening is to examine the segregation in your own lives. That doesn't mean if you don't have Black friends that you go out and say, let me go rent one. But I want you to think about your own choices of leisure and social life. And I also want you to think about where you grew up. Everybody says the same thing. If you ask somebody why they live where they live, and let's say they're married and they have children, they say they want safety and good schools. I have yet to meet somebody who says they want dangerous streets and subpar schools. But what choice do you have? Did you get an inheritance? What is wealth inequality? Did the banks give you a conventional loan and somebody Black or Latino with the same income an unconventional loan? All of our choices are shaped by some sort of invisible or visible policy. If you're from Chicago, ask your grandparents why they left when the neighborhood was turning. We talk about white flight in a vacuum as if white people went and pitched tents in the open prairie. They had somewhere to go. The federal government gave loans to new suburbs that were exclusionary. The federal government built highways to those new places. So understanding where you live and the choices that shape that, I think, is the one piece to try to understand this. And also thinking about how you can start breaking those barriers. If you're in the Woodlawn program, thinking about the questions, you're not going to get answers to all the questions. And that's okay. And you're going to hear probably 10 different solutions from 10 different people. But, you know, one person has told me that we need to think about, you know, arts and culture as a way to bind people and not think of them as the extras. Food, art, culture are things that make up a city. And so if you want to, you know, I'm not suggesting that you take the L at 3 in the morning to go exploring art and culture, but to start challenging yourself and thinking about how you can bust those own doors of segregation that you may have subconsciously had up. Before we go to Q&A, I just want to talk about the humanity of Black people, because sometimes we talk about communities of color or Black communities in terms of poverty and strife or exceptionalism. So on one hand, you have the Obamas and the Oprahs, or the entertainers and the athletes. And then we have this image of poverty, doing the perp walk on the 6 o'clock news, criminal justice, ghetto pathology. And there's this invisibility in the middle of working class and middle class Black folk, and what the diversity is within Blackness. So I thought that I would end by playing a story that just shows the regularness of Black people.
This summer, Comedy Central has been filming a sitcom in Chicago. The name of the show is Southside. It's a workplace comedy set in a rent-to-own store, and it aims to be free of stereotypes dogging, well, the South Side. WBEZ's Natalie Moore caught up with one of the executive producers on location and has this audio postcard.
We're in beautiful Inglewood, Chicago, Southside. Hey, that's my aunt. I have a lot of family and friends on set. My wife is on the show, my brother's on the show, family. We're shooting at Harold's Chicken on 63rd and Carpenter.
That's Bashir Salahuddin, creator, writer, showrunner of Southside. Actors mill about outside, waiting for hair and makeup. Salahuddin sets up the scene they're about to shoot for me. A character asks for extra mild sauce at the famous fried chicken joint.
The manager here says she's not giving him any more because he has single-handedly hurt the mild sauce industry with the number of mild sauces he's asked for.
I had to stifle my laugh as he told the story so it wouldn't get in the way of his tape. Minutes later, Salahuddin and I watched the scene with headphones on in the video tent. I couldn't record the bit, but I can tell you it's hilarious. I watched numerous takes, different spins on jokes, and Salahuddin give feedback to the director.
I feel really good about it, yeah.
I like loosening her up, by the way. I mean, I don't know if we want to keep going, but I feel like the more we tell her just do what you want to do, the more she keeps coming over.
Season 1 of Southside is expected to debut next year. A number of Chicago comedians and actors will be featured, such as Lil Rel and Lisa Ray, and many are behind the camera as writers. The sitcom has filmed at the South Shore Cultural Center and Kennedy King College. And the show will introduce an audience to up-and-coming funny men and women. But even a comedy set at a rent-to-own job feels the weight of trying to accurately represent Black Chicago. Too often, gun violence is the only thing the rest of the country thinks of.
We want to show you that this is a place that has philosophers and astronomers and teachers and, you know, people who will sell you stuff on the street and people who come to your house and fix your car better than anybody. And then there's a guy over here who'll have like a club in his basement.
In other words, the breadth of Blackness. This is personal for Salahuddin, a graduate of Whitney Young Magnet High School. He attended Harvard University, but the pull of acting and theater thwarted his plans to become a doctor. He's written for several television shows, including Late Night with Jimmy Fallon.
I grew up on 83rd and Halsted and 72nd and Constance, and my experience of Chicago was a lot more fun and a lot more joyous. And my experience of Chicagoans are a lot more happy and a lot more positive. And it's really important for us to show that and to show the fuller picture.
That doesn't mean he's erasing the challenges confronting the city. Southside is funny while focusing on employees trying to get ahead as they face socioeconomic and political challenges. Naturally, politics is unavoidable in Chicago. Southside will also delve into an automatic race. Salahuddin says when local residents see the crew filming, they do two things. One, ask to be an extra, or two, ask if the show is going to make the South Side look bad. Salahuddin says for the latter, the answer is, of course not. South Side will appear on the network that gave us pop culture staples like Chappelle's Show, The Daily Show, and South Park. With that kind of stage, perhaps the world will begin to see the South Side the way Salahuddin and other Southsiders have long viewed it. He says the television series will make all of Chicago feel honored. Natalie Moore, WBEZ.
One more.
Thanks for listening to WBEZ.
Thanks for listening. And I'm happy to take questions for like the next 10, 15 minutes. Are there yes, the mics in the middle.
Hello, my name is Hope Wood. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you for being here.
This was like a huge eye-opener for me, even after reading parts of your book. Just becoming more familiar with what gentrification really means and where some of those fears might be unwarranted or viewed in the wrong way. One question that came to mind as you were talking, and as you brought up One Woodlawn and things, was the community benefits agreement with the Obama Center, because that's still a form of like the community feeling like there's kind of a threat of not being heard or not having a say in the development of the community, even though there's something good coming and it is for everyone. So what would you say about the fact that the community benefits agreement has been denied, and what that means for Woodlawn residents?
I think that the conversation is going to change with whoever becomes the next mayor. Most of the mayoral candidates say that they support a CBA. Only a couple don't, and I think that's Bill Daley, who probably has a good chance of getting into the runoff. And I'm not sure if what Gary Chico said. I feel like there were two candidates who said no, but the rest have said yes. Now, of course, them saying yes could be pandering because that's what they think people want to hear and what will happen when he or she gets into office. But it has been a discussion point or a campaign point for candidates. I think that the Obama Foundation doesn't own the land. And so, you know, what the city has in store with those vacancies, I think that that's why the push should be, for those who want it, the push should probably be there because the city has more power to reshape the neighborhood than the Obama Foundation does. But, you know, both entities have said no. And then there's University of Chicago, which plays a big role behind the scene, although we're not quite sure what their role is, because they can be too stealth sometimes. But overall, the conversation is changing because you have a new mayor who's going to come in.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Isabella Balmo. Thank you so
Hi,
much
Isabel.
for being here.
My question is, what have you seen being done to promote food security in those vulnerable South and West Side communities?
There's been a growth in urban agriculture. There has been some growth in grocery stores, and there's been growth in nutrition. I would say Inglewood has been the community that's done probably the most work around this. There was a lot of controversy when Whole Foods came. I would say mostly from people outside the neighborhood, like, how is this going to work? And the store has had challenges because it's not like Aldi or Save-A-Lot, although I leave my own neighborhood to shop at that one because it's cheaper. The land is cheaper, so the developer had lower costs, so I think that's partly why the costs are able to be lower, and also trying to meet the neighborhood where it is. And then there's been opportunities for small businesses to be on the shelves there. So I think the conversation keeps happening. I have stopped using the word food desert. A lot of activists, and not that I'm an activist or I'm adopting language, but I do try to pay, I mentioned that I'm a wordsmith and I want to be accurate. People say, well, there is food there. It's just not healthy food, or it's too much fast food, or too many bad corner stores. And deserts are actually a part of our ecology. There's nothing wrong with the desert. So it's not really accurate. Some people rather use the phrase food apartheid. I don't use that unless I'm quoting someone directly. But I think that what I have seen just even over the past decade is more attention and more discussion around, and people recognizing. 'Cause I think for so long it was like, yeah, well, I have to leave my neighborhood to go to the grocery store, or that's just the way it is. And when you have people advocating in a different way, it becomes, well, this doesn't have to be acceptable. There's one area that I cover is the growth of using food stamps at farmers markets. So farmers markets are another way to help with food insecurity, but we've also seen that if you add grocery stores or add healthy food, that might not change what happens in the neighborhood. You have to have an educational component. You have to do cooking demonstrations. Some of the things that are probably the most successful are school-based programs, because then you have children who have changed their habits, or they go home and ask their parents for something different.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Natalie. I'm Jordan. I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the relationship between displacement and replacement in Hyde Park, which is just north of Woodlawn, and whether or not you think Woodlawn and the developments that are coming there as a result of the library runs the risk of turning into the next Hyde Park.
Short answer, no. The neighborhoods are too far apart in median income, housing value for that to happen. Definitely not in my lifetime. I don't see that happening. But could some of the pressures of Hyde Park spill into Woodlawn? I live in Hyde Park, and the one thing that has changed is the University of Chicago sold many of the apartment buildings that they own to an owner out of state who doesn't have the same maybe sort of mission or vested interest, and so rents have gone up. Again, I would not call this gentrification, but housing prices are going up, and there have been new buildings that rental buildings that have really, really steep prices. Jeannie Gang, the famous architect, has done 2 buildings, and the rents are the kind of rents you would see in Lincoln Park. I was in one of those buildings over the weekend, and the person who lived there said that most of the people who live there are Chinese students. So I think what we're seeing is, Chinese students who are there to go to the University of Chicago and who can't afford. So, what is the balance of the neighborhood? There should be, like, I'm all for diversity of housing stock. I can never afford, I don't begrudge places that I can't afford to live in. But but I also think that there's such bad urban planning that goes on in the city. And those kind of prices, like, what are you, and these aren't dorms, so I just question what is the end game for the neighborhood? And the university selling those properties is having an impact now and will continue to have an impact. So will some of those people go to Woodlawn because they can't afford? I think that has already happened for some people. If you want to buy a single-family home in Hyde Park or in Kenwood, that's always been a lot more expensive. So do you go to Woodlawn? But for some people, Woodlawn doesn't have. There are 2 coffee shops. Again, if you're using coffee shops as the harbinger of what good urban development is, but there aren't a lot of amenities that are there. So I don't, if you're transient, maybe, but if you're someone who's looking to put down some roots, I don't know.
That's helpful. Thank you. Hi, my name is Monique Flores. Thank you for being here tonight. So I know that you said regarding gentrification that it is class and not race. And while I think that that's the ideal, I feel that oftentimes we find class and race intertwined. So with that, going about integration, how do you find it that you actually integrate and not totally displace people who can't afford to live there anymore?
That's a really good question. And as I said, race and class are first cousins, and they do go hand in hand. We heard Maddie Butler talk about property tax freezes. So I think the question is, what kind of policies do you put into place that protect the existing residents? Ones who live there, ones who weathered the storm, ones who, have done the work and should reap the benefits. So, thinking about protecting those residents as you see transition. I also think that we have to open up other communities. So if you look at the racial demographics and the affordable housing demographics of places like Lincoln Park, River North, the Loop, they tend to be white, wealthy, and exclusive. So it's not just about, integration isn't just about, well, let's move white people into black spaces. And it's not about social engineering saying, okay, well, these people have to move to these places. It's really about getting rid of barriers. And a lot of those barriers are really unsexy. They have to do like with zoning or, other kind of city policies that are important, but maybe don't attract the same attention as, let's say, police misconduct or police brutality. Like, that's easier to march for than, well, this is zoned R1, and if you really want to have diversity in your housing stock, you should make this, you should have apartments here. So it's really getting to, and there are people who are much better experts than me, but the one thing I didn't say is that none of this is rocket science. Like, it's not one thing that's gonna be done. It's not even 10 things. It's 100 things. But the solutions are there. It's about political will. Some of you may recall Jefferson Park on the northwest side, mostly white neighborhood. I mean, there was a developer wanting to build some affordable housing there, and the neighborhood lost its mind. Like, we don't want those people here, or even here in the suburbs. I did a story about Deerfield, which its median income is 6 figures. It's about 90% white. Its history has a lot to do with racial exclusion. A church wanted to build some affordable housing. And some of the public comments were, we don't want those Chicago people coming with putting their cars on cinder blocks. I have never seen a car on cinder blocks in Chicago.
I agree.
And, you know, the zoning, they weren't able to do it because of so much pushback. And we don't think regionally, I mean, there's just so many things wrong with how we look at housing and educational policy in not just Chicago, but in this region. And a lot of it has to do with fear and lack of imagination. But the policies are there.
Great. Thank you so much.
Hi, Natalie. My name is Kristen. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for being here.
You made a comment earlier about the fact that some people feel very uncomfortable with different changes happening in the neighborhood, saying these changes aren't for me. You gave the example of bike lanes, which I think was very appropriate. And you followed up by saying the make it for you. And I'm curious how you would interpret what that might look like for those who are coming from limited resources. What does it mean to empower with words and then with actions? How can you actually make it for you?
Yeah, so I'm going to use the Whole Foods example again. So when that announcement came, there was a lot of head scratching, a lot of national coverage, and terrible comments like those are going to be healthy eating gangbangers. Or, well, black people, you've been given your notice. You've got to be out of here by 2016. By the way, Inglewood is still black, still mostly low income. I don't know that I heard those sentiments as much from people in the neighborhood. And I'm not saying this to sound like PR-y for Whole Foods, but I've never seen a company do community engagement the way Whole Foods did. They had a number of community meetings and took in resident impact from everything about store design to paint colors to just all sorts of things. And I remember at one meeting, like what kind of foods, I mean, because they did adapt things for that store. So residents were at the table and these meetings were packed. And I remember at one, I remember two things. The then co-CEO really saw this as a personal mission. And he said that so many residents said to him, don't, and it is a smaller store, you know, it's not like the bells and whistles store at Lincoln Park. But he said that people in the community said to him, don't make this a Half Foods, make it a Whole Foods. And I was at one meeting and someone said, are you gonna sell alcohol? And they said, no, well, we didn't. They're like, no, we want you to sell wine and beer here too. They said, oh, you do? Okay, well, we'll do that. So maybe alcohol is not the best example, but just the idea that they were listening and they told them what they wanted. And the residents didn't say, oh, well, they're just trying to push us out. That's not for us. They came to the table and made demands. And they also said, not only do we want you to hire returning citizens, people who've been in prison, we want you to consider hiring people who have a violent background. Because often when we hear about ban the box or hire returning citizens, it's for nonviolent. And they said, no, well, we want you to, and I think that they did. Not everybody would, admit to what that was, but those are the kind of things that they said. So so no matter what the issue is, whether it's private company or city, you just say what you want. You have community meetings, you have public accountability.
Thank you.
I think we're done with time. Thank you.
Well, I was going to invite you to join me again in thanking Natalie for being here, but you've just done that. You were ahead of me, but why don't I ask you again anyway, and you can thank her again.